He pioneered a broadcast institution and in the process helped make ABC a television news powerhouse. Each weeknight for a quarter of a century, those of us who wanted an in-depth look at the world turned to Nightline. It was the antithesis of the opinion-driven, celebrity-light reporting now so often dominating the airwaves. Today, the past, present, and future of American journalism through the lens of Ted Koppel. I'm Lawrence Pintak, founding dean of the Edward R. Murrow College of Communication at Washington State University. And to borrow from the cadence of my guest, this is the Murrow Interview. Ted, has television news become a distraction from the real world?
Well, television news has become something of an oxymoron. There isn't a whole lot of news on, unless by news you define it as that light, frothy entertainment that people enjoy watching to distract them from the realities of the world out there. There are still great news programs out there. I would consider PBS's Lehrer NewsHour, for example, to be a great program. I think what's done on National Public Radio is quite extraordinary. But by and large, broadcast television news has become a prisoner of the marketplace, finds that it has to appeal to people's tastes rather than to what they need. And that, in a democracy such as ours, is a very dangerous development.
You did Nightline for 25 years. Your last broadcast you ended with, "You've always been very nice to me," talking to the viewers. So give this new anchor team for Nightline a fair break. If you don't, I promise you the network will just put another comedy show in this time slot. Is that bitter, cynical, or prescient?
Well, I mean, Nightline is still there. There is a program that has the name Nightline attached to it.
Some would call it Lightline.
Well, it's not quite the program that I would have done, and it's not the program that I did. But that's why I'm no longer there, and they are. And you know, it must be said, it is an enormously successful program. From a commercial point of view, Nightline is now #1 in the 11:30 time slot, and that means it's beating two comedy powerhouses, the Tonight Show and the Late Night Show with David Letterman. But I don't think it is a serious news program anymore. Certainly, it's a very different kind of news program, and they feel the need most nights to at least leaven whatever serious news they're doing with an awful lot of light news.
Isn't it always a trade-off? I mean, Murrow did person to person as well as see it now.
And hated it. I once, you and I have a common friend, Tom Pintak, who used to be the executive producer of Dan Rather's show, was executive producer of Nightline, and he had worked for the legendary Fred Friendly. And so I was invited to Tom's home, where they were hosting Fred and his wife on the occasion of Fred's 80th birthday. Well, I had a wooden hanger that had been given to me some years ago by someone who knew what a fan I was of Murrow's. And it was a person-to-person hanger. Fred Friendly, as you know, and as many of our guests here may know also, was a man who spoke his mind freely. So I had this thing all wrapped up, and I gave it to Fred, and he unwrapped it, and he looked at it, and he said, "I hated that goddamn program," right? Well, to the best of my understanding, so did Murrow. And he did it as part of a trade-off. He did it because CBS, in effect, was saying to him, you know, we need the money to do the kind of serious journalism you want to do. Here's something you can do that makes money for the network, and we don't really much care whether you like it or not. Go ahead and do it. But you're quite right. And yet by today's standards, that would count as pretty high caliber journalism, the kind of interviews that it did on person to person.
The economics of the industry changed when the CBSs and the NBCs started getting gobbled up by the conglomerates. How is there any way now that the penny pinchers are in charge? It used to be that the networks, it was their obligation to spend money on news because they were making so much money on everything else. Now it becomes bottom line. How do you get back to a place where there's serious journalism?
Well, I'm not sure. And what you say about the corporations gobbling up the networks is true, but I'm not sure that those are the main reasons why the networks are doing what they're doing today. Two other factors. One is the absolute technological explosion that occurred in the late 70s, early 80s with satellite television, cable television, the internet, so that whereas once you only had the three networks, ABC, NBC, and CBS competing with one another, now you have 1,000 competitors out there. And the size of the audience really has not changed all that much. So if you had a television audience of 100 million people, you still have a television audience of 100 million people, but now instead of dividing it among three networks, it's being divided among hundreds, thousands of outlets. The other factor is that during the 1980s, during the Reagan administration, there was a de-emphasis on institutional oversight, deregulation. The FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, was one of the agencies that was defanged. So that whereas in the past, even networks had to worry about the theoretical possibility that their licenses could be withdrawn, no license of a broadcaster has even been suspended over the last 35 to 40 years. So the oversight agency has no teeth. Competition is worse than it ever was, and as you pointed out, the networks are now owned by giant corporations, and each of the networks now is seen in that horrible phrase as a profit center. You got to make money, otherwise out you go.
We as journalists have changed. How we cover the nation and the world has changed. America has changed. Deeply divided. You know, I, coming back from overseas, am shocked at how divided this country is. How culpable are we as journalists for the state of America?
Well, having sort of laid out the economic framework that makes us what we are today, I think we are extremely culpable. To put it as simply as I know how, these days we give the American public what it wants rather than what it needs. Now that sounds terribly elitist, but the fact of the matter is that most other people, other than journalists, have lives of their own, professions of their own. They're spending 8, 10, 12 hours a day doing what they do as lawyers, as teachers, as bus drivers, whatever that is. They count on journalists to go out and not only gather the information that is important, but put it into some kind of context, put it into some kind of order. This is important to you because. And these days we don't do much of that anymore. These days we sort of stick our finger in the air and say, what do you like? You know, you want to hear more about Charlie Sheen? We'll give you more about Charlie Sheen. You know, you want to hear about some missing blonde in the Caribbean? We'll give you hours on that missing blonde in the Caribbean. And that is, I think, a dereliction of duty on our part. And you cannot help but recognize that in a culture in which even politics has become a matter of giving people what they like in broadcasting. You know, if you fall on the conservative side of the ledger, go watch Fox. If you fall on the liberal side, go watch MSNBC. If you listen to talk radio, you know, you can just sort of skip across the dial and pretty soon you'll find someone who resonates with absolutely the worst biases that you had tucked away deep in your psyche somewhere. That creates a political climate in which compromise is not just difficult, but frequently impossible. Where as soon as a politician from one party acknowledges the virtue of a position by a politician on the other side, he gets clobbered in the media, making it more and more difficult for people to do what is really in the interest of the American public, and making it more likely that what they will do is say those things that their supporters and that particular segment of the political pie wants to hear. That's very dangerous.
Those on the conservative side of that pie would say that this was necessary because you, the big three networks, force-fed a liberal view of the world to the nation.
And I think to a certain extent there was some merit to that argument. I don't deny that journalists by and large, and I'm talking about the men and women who were sort of on the ground, not the folks in the 19th floor offices, but the ones on the ground, have a tendency to sympathize with the people that they're covering. You go off to a war, you're out in the field with the Marines or with the Army. You tend to sympathize with those young men and women down in the lower ranks, whereas perhaps the more conservative point of view would be to listen to what the Secretary of Defense is saying or what the generals at the Pentagon are saying. Same thing in terms of social issues. If you're covering what's happening in some of the inner cities of this country, you can't help but feel some sympathy for the people whose misery you are seeing day in and day out. All I'm saying is that Rupert Murdoch and Roger Ailes were correct in saying if the networks were shading it to one side or the other, it was certainly more on the liberal side than on the conservative side. But it wasn't anywhere near as extreme as it is today. The notion that you might sympathize with people in trouble isn't quite the same thing as saying you have what amounts to a personal commitment. And I'm not saying that the networks today are doing that. I don't think that's one of the failures of ABC, NBC, or CBS. Their failure is different. They're catering to sort of the lowest popular taste. But the business of political bias, while it did exist 30 years ago, nothing like what exists today.
I mean, part of that criticism of that bias is the kind of in crowd in Washington. You're good friends with Kissinger. Yeah. There have been studies of your shows that claim that most of the people interviewed are government spokespeople, et cetera. How did that shape, that Washington social scene, New York social scene elite shape coverage back then?
Well, look, the fact of the matter is I became friends with Henry Kissinger when I worked as diplomatic correspondent for ABC. I was on the road with him sometimes for weeks at a time, as were many of my colleagues. We became friends at that time. It wasn't much of a social friendship. I must tell you, my wife and I are not, we're not really social animals. I didn't hit the Georgetown scene. I didn't go to the parties, didn't go to the dinners.
I don't know, you always came across as a party animal to me.
Wild, wild. And so, yes, there was that one friendship, but that criticism. And the interesting thing is, in this day of the internet now, if one outlet says one thing about you, it doesn't have to be good, doesn't have to be bad. For example, the internet says I speak German, French, and Russian. I do speak German and French. I speak half a dozen words of Russian. I have tried to correct that. Every time that I give a speech anywhere, I am introduced as someone who speaks German, French, and Russian. I can't get rid of it.